Okay, so anyone who's been following the Israel-Hamas situation knows
Yeah.
it feels like things are really coming to a head,
Right.
especially with Trump winning the election.
Mm-hmm.
The stakes just seem so much higher now.
Yeah. No, for sure.
We've got some reports here
Okay.
that are digging into what's happening with the negotiations,
All right.
what the potential roadblocks,
Mm-hmm.
and what could the future hold. So really trying to get a grasp on all of that.
Yeah, the timing is really interesting right now. You've got these indirect talks happening
Right.
between Hamas and Israel,
Yeah.
and it's such a tense atmosphere.
Oh, for sure.
And you've got these big players trying to broker some sort of deal, Qatar, Egypt, the United States,
Yeah.
and they've all got their own agendas, their own ways of approaching it.
Totally. It's like
Yeah.
everyone's walking on a tightrope trying not to upset the balance.
Totally.
And the deal that they're talking about, this prisoner exchange,
Mhm.
it's multi-phase. So already it's kind of complicated.
It really is. That first phase is all about releasing these elderly and sick Palestinian detainees.
Right.
So on the surface, it seems like, okay, this is a gesture of goodwill, right?
Yeah.
But even that is more complicated than it sounds.
How so?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems pretty straightforward.
Well, the reports are highlighting these pretty serious disputes
Yeah.
over the legal terms. Like, how would they even sequence these releases?
Oh,
It's not just, okay, open the doors, everyone goes free.
Right.
Both sides are looking at every little detail and
Right.
trying to make sure that they're not making some concession
Yeah.
that's going to put them in a weaker position down the line.
So even something that seems like a simple humanitarian gesture,
Yeah.
it becomes this battleground in a way.
It shows you just how deep that mistrust runs
Yeah.
between the two sides.
For sure.
And then when you add in that next phase, where it could potentially involve
Right.
releasing Israeli military personnel who are being held in Gaza,
Yeah.
I mean, the stakes get even higher.
I can only imagine.
Yeah.
Those individuals represent so much more
Absolutely.
than just prisoners
Yeah.
to both sides.
Mhm.
They're like symbols of the conflict,
Totally.
past sacrifices, future aspirations.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine either side
Uh.
easily compromising
Right.
on that point.
Yeah, and now you throw Trump's election win into the mix.
Right.
And it's a whole other level of complexity, right?
Exactly.
I mean, we all know he's very pro-Israel. That's well documented.
Yeah.
So that's going to have some kind of impact on how these negotiations go.
That's the big question.
Yeah.
Is his stance going to help things move forward,
Right.
or is it going to throw a wrench in the whole thing?
I mean, it's tough to say for sure.
Yeah.
But on the one hand, his policies might embolden Israel
Okay.
to kind of take a harder line.
Demand more concessions from Hamas.
And knowing Hamas, I don't
Yeah.
see that going over very well.
Right. And then you have to think about the impact on the mediators.
Right.
I mean, if the U.S. is taking this more aggressive stance,
Yeah.
it could make it a lot harder for Qatar and Egypt,
Right.
who've been trying to get a
Yeah.
more balanced dialogue going.
It's already this balancing act, and now it's like
Yeah.
someone just came and shifted all the weight around.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the overall tone of the negotiations.
Mhm.
You have to look at how his policies might actually affect those specific sticking points.
Okay, let's get into those roadblocks,
Yeah,
because the reports are pointing to three big ones.
they are, yeah.
Right.
So first, there's a whole issue of control over Gaza.
Okay.
Netanyahu has said many times
Yeah.
he's determined to keep control over those strategic border crossings.
Okay.
And he wants to limit how much Hamas fighters can move around within the territory.
Hmm.
From Israel's perspective, I can see why that
Mm-hmm.
seems essential for security.
Yeah.
But from Hamas's perspective, that must feel like they're constantly being boxed in.
Exactly.
So that's one. What's the second big sticking point?
So the second one is Hamas's core demand.
Okay.
They have not budged on this.
Yeah.
They want a complete Israeli withdrawal from Gaza
Wow.
and a total ceasefire
Okay.
as preconditions to any kind of agreement.
So basically, they're asking for the status quo to be completely reversed,
Yeah.
which seems like a non-starter for Israel.
It does, and that gap between what each side considers non-negotiable,
Right.
that's a huge obstacle.
Yeah.
It's like they're trying to build a bridge, but starting from opposite ends.
Right. And I'm guessing the third roadblock doesn't make things any easier.
No, not at all. So this one gets into the weeds a bit, the legal stuff.
Okay.
Both sides are fighting over the exact wording of the agreement.
So more than just
Yeah.
lawyers arguing over commas.
Way more than that. It's about making sure that whatever they agree to doesn't end up tying their hands later on,
Right.
They're looking for loopholes, clauses, anything that gives them that operational freedom.
Can you give me an example of what that kind of operational freedom would look like?
So, for example, Hamas might want to be sure they keep control over border crossings.
Right.
So they can control trade and the movement of people.
Makes sense.
It gives them some leverage, some autonomy.
Okay.
Well, Israel might demand that Hamas's military capabilities are limited.
Right.
They want to restrict their ability to rearm, to fortify their positions.
So even within the agreement itself, it's this power struggle.
Exactly.
We both want to make sure they're not giving away more than they're getting.
Totally.
It's tough.
Yeah.
You've got this negotiation that's already so fragile, this deep mistrust that we've been talking about, and now you've got Trump's influence looming over everything. Yeah. What are some possible scenarios we could see playing out?
Well, the reports lay out 3 potential paths.
Okay.
So the reports lay out 3 potential paths.
Okay.
The first one, and I think the one everyone's hoping for, is the scenario of gradual progress.
Okay.
Imagine, they manage to build some trust as they go along, and they just take these incremental steps.
Right, like a phased approach where they kind of chip away at the issues one by one.
Exactly. So, those prisoner releases would lead to a ceasefire.
Okay.
And the whole thing would be carefully overseen by those international mediators we were talking about.
So it would require both sides to be super patient.
Oh, yeah.
Willing to compromise.
For sure.
And honestly, a bit of luck wouldn't hurt either.
It would take a lot of luck, but it's not impossible.
It's definitely the outcome that everybody wants to see, but it's going to be an uphill battle, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah.
Which leads us to that second scenario, which is a lot more concerning.
The escalation scenario.
Right.
If these talks fall apart, if either side feels like they're being backed into a corner, things could go south really quickly.
It's like a tinderbox.
Yeah.
And someone just threw a match in.
Exactly.
More violence, more suffering. And then there's the potential for this to spiral even further out of control and pull in other players in the region.
Yeah, it could easily escalate beyond just those 2 parties.
It's a scary thought, honestly.
It is. It really underscores just how important it is to find a peaceful solution.
But even as we're talking about these different scenarios, there's that wild card looming over everything.
Right.
The Trump administration.
Right. Can't forget about that.
He could be a catalyst for peace.
Potentially.
Or he could make things a whole lot worse.
Yeah, it's really one of the most interesting parts of this whole thing. Because we know he's pledged his full support to Israel.
Right.
But what does that mean, practically speaking?
Right. Like, what are the concrete actions that come with that support?
Nobody knows. That's the million-dollar question.
There's a whole range of possibilities.
Totally.
He could try and push for a quick resolution, use his influence to get both sides, to make concessions.
He could.
He could take a more hands-off approach.
Right.
And let the current mediation efforts play out.
Yeah.
Or his actions could unintentionally make tensions worse.
It's possible.
If he pushes policies that seem biased towards Israel, that could alienate the Palestinians and embolden hardliners on both sides?
It could, and that would make compromise that much harder.
So even with good intentions, he could end up being a destabilizing force.
It's like walking a tightrope,
Yeah.
One wrong step.
Exactly.
It all falls apart.
And then you've got to think about the internal dynamics within both Israel and Palestine.
Yeah.
On the Israeli side, Netanyahu's got pressure from the right wing who don't want to see him give an inch to Hamas.
Right. Any concession is seen as weakness.
Exactly.
And then you've got the divisions within Palestine between Hamas and Fatah that makes negotiations even more difficult.
It's like some crazy multi-dimensional chess game.
It is.
With all these different players and all these competing interests.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of.
It really is. And that's why these deep dives are so helpful. Because they help us get past the headlines.
Exactly.
To really understand what's going on.
Get the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so important to not oversimplify.
Right.
Especially in a situation like this where every decision has such huge consequences.
So we've talked about some potential scenarios, but it still feels like there's so much uncertainty.
There is.
Like we're just waiting to see how all these pieces fall into place, how these different forces interact. It's fascinating, but also a little bit terrifying.
I get that. I think one thing that might help is to ask ourselves some key questions.
Okay.
Questions that go deeper than the day-to-day news cycle.
All right, I'm all ears. What kind of questions should we be asking?
Well, one that comes to mind is how Trump's going to approach this whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah.
I mean, we know it's going to be different from how his predecessors handled things.
Yeah.
He's already said he's skeptical of the two-state solution.
Right.
So could that embolden some of those voices in Israel who want to annex parts of the West Bank?
It's not just about what he says either.
Right.
It's about how those policies actually play out.
Absolutely.
And then you have to consider how both the Israelis and the Palestinians are going to react to those policy shifts.
Exactly. And then what about Hamas internally?
Yeah.
Are they going to be willing to moderate their position at all?
Right.
Or will they see this as a chance to push their own agenda even harder?
It's like we can't forget that these aren't just single entities we're talking about.
Right.
They're made up of different groups
Totally.
with their own interests, their own power struggles.
It's a lot more complicated than just Israel versus Hamas, you know?
Exactly. And what about the international community?
Yeah, that's huge.
Are Egypt and Qatar going to be able to keep mediating?
Right.
If the U.S. takes a side?
That's big if.
What about the EU?
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to step up
It's possible.
to try and balance things out?
We'll have to see.
Yeah, it's crazy. It really is like this giant web.
Yeah.
You pull on one thread and the whole thing.
That's a good way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Shakes.
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming.
It really can.
But that's exactly why we need to resist the urge to oversimplify.
Right.
There are no easy answers here.
Definitely not.
There's no magic solution.
And that brings me back to something you said earlier about having informed dialogue and avoiding those simplistic explanations.
For someone who wants to really engage with this issue, what advice would you give them?
I think the first thing is to really be humble about it.
Okay.
You know, acknowledge that this is a conflict with a long and messy history.
Yeah.
And nobody has all the answers.
Right.
Be open to hearing different points of view, even ones that you might not agree with.
So it's more about seeking understanding than being right.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's also about being aware of those biases
Absolutely.
that can creep into the information we consume.
Yeah.
Like, really pay attention to where you're getting your news from. Are they presenting all sides?
Yeah, right. Are they pushing a particular narrative?
It's easy to get stuck in those echo chambers where you only hear what you already believe.
Yeah. And one last thing I'd say is to remember the human cost of this conflict.
Yeah.
It's easy to get lost in the politics and the strategy, but at the end of the day, this is about real people whose lives are being shattered by this violence and instability.
It's easy to forget that when you're looking at the headlines.
Yeah.
But there are real stories of loss and fear and resilience behind all of this.
Exactly.
Stories that need to be heard.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive.
Thank you.
It's given us a lot to think about.
Thank you,
So thank you for breaking it all down for us.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, I hope this deep dive has helped you see this conflict in a new light.
I hope so too.
It's a tough situation.
Yeah.
But the more we understand the nuances, the different perspectives, the history, the better equipped we are to have these really important conversations.
Couldn't agree more.
About finding a path to peace.
Totally.
So until next time, keep learning, keep questioning.
And keep diving deep.
We'll see you then.